These 10 pieces of workshop furniture changed everything. They were very simple to build and gave me more room to work in my small shop. There are folding workbenches, flipping tool carts, and the last build I actually make cabinets inexpensive and attainable. I also give you plenty of woodworking tips that will fast track your skills, and some I felt real silly not knowing sooner. I used to think workbenches needed to look like this, or even this. But since building my current workbench, I'm having second thoughts. I implemented one simple strategy to keep it from wobbling, and I haven't seen this workbench on YouTube yet. Because I'm in a smaller space, I need to build my shop furniture accordingly. It may look a little bigger in the video, but I'm in a one-car garage workshop. And I feel very fortunate for the space that I do have because I know a lot of people are in smaller spaces than me. But anytime I build something like this workbench, I need it to be space efficient and practical. And I want it to look good because I'm in this shop a lot. I need this tabletop to be light, and you'll see why in a few minutes. So I'm not just gluing two pieces of 3/4 inch plywood together. I'm actually cutting 3-inch strips and gluing them to the underside of the tabletop to give this some much needed rigidity and also keep it light. This will also create more surface area to attach the hardwood border to the edges of this tabletop, and that is really important because I will be able to then attach the tabletop latches connecting the top to the legs. Okay, so why am I making what looks like two tabletop pieces? Well, I'm glad you asked. I will be connecting these two tabletop pieces using hinges, and that will allow me to fold this workbench up when I'm not using it, putting it out of the way, and allowing it to only take up 9.5 inches of space away from the wall, allowing me to have, you guessed it, a lot more room for activities. That is how the tabletop will fold up, but in a few minutes you'll see how the legs will fold in to make this folding workbench possible. For the tabletop border, I'm using white oak because it's what I had on hand, and this is 4/4 white oak, which is actually closer to 3/4 of an inch, and I'm just attaching it to the edges using glue and clamps. Because I don't have long enough clamps, I'm doubling up and even tripling up clamps to get the length I need to attach this tabletop border. I'm doing this to this large tabletop piece and also to the smaller tabletop piece. And now on to the legs. I know this is probably overkill, but because I have a planer, I ran all the 2x4s through it, which I'm going to be using for the legs, because it makes the wood look a lot nicer and makes it so I don't really have to sand. The leg construction I'm using on this, which is actually the same leg construction I used on the first folding workbench I made, is really easy but also makes for a really sturdy leg structure. I'm essentially gluing two 2x4s together, leaving space for an upper support piece and a lower support piece, which will make these legs really strong. I'm cutting a notch in this lower piece, which is where a long stretcher will go. And that's one way to keep this workbench from wobbling, but it's not the main way. I've created detailed written step-by-step plans for this build, and to go along with that, there's a 30-minute instructional video, so if you want to build this, you can build it alongside watching me build it in the video. There will be a link in the description to these plans, or you can just go to thomascustomwoodworks.com. The last thing I'll say is my goal for the plans that I create is to make them accessible to everyone so even a beginner can follow them and build the project no problem. There'll be a materials list, a tools and accessories list, cut list, and diagrams with every measurement that you'll need so you can ensure that the build will be a success. Even though glue would probably be enough, To decrease the dry time and to make sure that these leg structures will stay together for years and years to come, I'm reinforcing a lot of the glue joints with screws and then hiding them with dowels. I'm just not a huge fan of exposed screws in most cases, so I recessed the screws and I'm hiding them with oak dowels because I think that will be a nice contrast. Another way you could reinforce these glue joints is to skip the screws and just use dowels, but I use screws because to me it's just a little simpler. Okay, it's pocket hole time. I don't use pocket holes a ton, but they're gonna work well for this workbench, and I'm reinforcing it with glue so that they can be really strong. Over the next few minutes, you'll be seeing the other folding workbench that I built that mounts onto the wall in the background of this video, and you may be wondering why I'm making another folding workbench. I'll answer that question in a minute, but first I want to tell you what the one simple strategy is that will keep this workbench from wobbling. It is adding a diagonal cross brace to this workbench base. This does a much better job than a horizontal brace of keeping everything stable, and honestly, I'm not sure why, but I've tried both and this works much better. If you know why this works much better, please share it in the comments. Now, to make this folding workbench fold, I'm going to be attaching the legs to the base using hinges. And these are the same hinges that I'll be using for the tabletop to make that fold. Okay, so why am I building another folding workbench? Well, the first reason is the first folding workbench I built was a little big for my space. The tabletop was 76 inches by 36 inches, and this one will be a little smaller. The second reason is I got a lot of feedback from people saying they did not like how much valuable wall space the first folding workbench I built took up. And this workbench will take up less wall space, but in my opinion, less valuable wall space. I'm marking exactly where these tabletop hinges will go because I'm going to use my router and a straight cut bit to recess these hinges into the tabletop. If I skipped this step, the hinges would get in the way of the legs when I fold them in. Using original Gorilla polyurethane glue and screws to attach the hinges to the tabletop pieces, and using both Gorilla Glue and screws will ensure that these hinges will not loosen over time. Now remember when I said I did not like the look of exposed screws, so I cover them with dowels? Well, in this case, attaching the small tabletop piece, I did not cover the screws with dowels, but I have a very good reason for that. I didn't feel like it. Moving on. Attaching the large tabletop piece to what I've already built was really easy. All I did was use the Gorilla Glue and screws, and then this tabletop should fold up perfectly, right? So the big tabletop piece is resting a little slanted, and it's because the edges are hitting each other. I think it's because I had to recess the hinges so much. And I want this to rest straight down, but I think it's going to be an easy fix. I'm just going to chamfer the edges that are hitting each other on the small tabletop piece and the large tabletop piece, and that should fix the issue. And that did fix the issue. But when I was literally completely done with this workbench, another problem arose that I had to deal with. But for now, let's just enjoy the fact that this workbench can now fold easily and works perfectly. I personally like to put finish on my workshop furniture. I know some people do, some people don't, but I really like the way it looks and it protects it a little bit from liquids. I've had a few people ask me what these latches are called, and they're called toggle latches or toggle clamps. Although these latches do help keep the legs and the tabletop connected, I do not trust them on their own, so I'm adding this lower stretcher. And I even technically use a hand tool to complete this next step, though I don't think Shannon Rogers has to worry about me starting a competing hand tool school. I was utterly exhausted from using that hand tool, so I did the other side with the jigsaw. Okay, at this point, I want you to try and feel what I'm feeling. I'm so elated and excited that I finally finished this workbench, only to discover that it will not fold up properly, and at this point initially, I do not know why. It was actually a really simple fix. The latches were getting in the way of the tabletop, so I just needed to cut 2 recesses in the tabletop. Tradition is great. Tradition connects the past to the present. And there's also room for new things, for creativity and innovation. And I don't consider myself an innovator, but I do like to create. And I think everybody has the ability to be creative. There's room for everyone at the table, and if I could leave you with 2 things, it would be to be kind and be awesome. I have 11 tips that will enhance your woodworking skills, and you may want to pay extra attention to number 7. I'm taking my job site table saw into professional cabinet territory without the high price tag. But I'm not just building any old table saw cart. This could literally save you a trip to the hospital. Let's get into it. As you can see here, if you have your eyes open, my job site saw is completely open, which makes dust collection an absolute nightmare. And I'm using my shop vac, which is not a great solution, and I'm gonna change all that. I'll enclose my table saw, and although a shop vac is better than nothing, I'm going to switch to something that will be a big upgrade. Okay, let's do something that your significant other did not want to do for a while when you started dating. I generally always label my pieces, and that ensures that I don't misplace or misuse any of the pieces that might be similar sizes. I'm really excited about this table saw cart because it's going to greatly decrease the amount of dust that will go into my lungs, but also most tips and tricks videos go to 10, but I thought this video needed that extra push over the cliff, so this one goes to 11. I'm getting all the pieces to the main carcass of the cart cut to size, and then this middle shelf will be attached using pocket holes. I don't like to have to measure each individual piece, so when I can, I like to use referential measurements. That just means that I reference the part of the project that's already done to make sure future pieces are cut to the exact size they need to be. No fancy joinery here. I'm going to be attaching the pieces in the cabinet using butt joints and screws, and I'm just marking exactly where those screws need to go. If you're at all sensitive to creepy or frightening things, please look away now because apparently my workshop is haunted. But if I do indeed have a ghost, I'm definitely naming him Jeff. When I'm gluing up my pieces, I like to use what my daughter calls bluey tape, and if you don't get that reference, you are missing out. It's in reference to a show that's pretty much for adults. And I'll put this tape on the joints, and as long as I take the tape off when the glue is still wet, it greatly helps with cleanup if there is some glue squeeze out. I have a lot of screws to drive in this cabinet, and I used to not have an impact driver and just use my regular drill, but this is just so nice to have. It really makes quick work of driving in screws, and although it might not be essential in this project, if you're drilling any screws into the studs in your wall, this is definitely needed. The regular drill just will not drill some screws into the studs. You may be getting the hint that if I can avoid measuring, I'll avoid it. And that's why I'm using spacers to make sure this middle shelf is in the exact spot that it needs to be. It's time to make this cart mobile, and to secure the plywood feet, which the casters will screw into, I'm using some California glue, or CA glue for short. I'm using wood glue and CA glue with accelerator here, and the CA glue dries within about 20 or 30 seconds, acting as a clamp for the wood glue so I can move on and work on other parts of the project. And to ensure that this cart will hold the weight of my table saw and the material I run through it, I thought I would test out its weight limit, really the only way that I thought makes sense. It's no secret, I'm a big fan of unique storage solutions. In my workshop, yes, but also in the rest of my garage, which is why I'm installing the garage lifting storage rack from FlexiMounts. This 4-foot by 4-foot storage rack can hold loads up to 300 pounds and is actually pretty comfortable, almost too comfortable, but I'll get to that in a second. It's suitable for garages less than 9 feet high and can be installed in concrete ceilings or wood joists with 12, 16, or 24-inch spacing. I wanted to test out the holding capacity and see if it could at least hold 175 pounds of man, which it did a phenomenal job of. But I guess I was pretty beat by the install, so I accidentally took a nap that you could say is a little on the longer side. I guess I was a little surprised that I slept for so long, but no big deal. I went inside, shaved, and got back to work. FlexiMounts is a US company that provides storage and organizing solutions for garage and home, and their products are highly rated on Amazon, with their classic garage racks like this one being bestsellers. It was surprisingly fun to raise and lower this, and my wife is very happy that our garage is much more organized now. All right, now let's get back to the build. Okay, here's how I'm making sure that the tabletop for this cart will be the exact height that I need it to be for my table saw, and this can be adapted to any job site table saw. I'm just marking how tall these sides need to be for a small storage area and an extended cutting surface. It was really important that I made this cart easily adapted to any job site table saw, because I created really detailed written and video plans for this project, which can be found on my website, thomascustomwoodworks.com, and I'll also put a link to those plans in the video description below. And since I'm in a small one-car garage workshop and space is at a premium, I'll be adding a foldable wing to this cart, giving it even more cutting surface, and it can fold down and out of the way when not in use. It's really important for me to have shop furniture that's space efficient, because it just gives me so much more room for activities. Few tips that I give on this channel will ever be as good as number 7 coming up, and I don't want you to just read these words, I want you to internalize them, because they can really help you in the future in woodworking and in life. Yes, that tip was objectively hilarious, but seriously, sometimes it's good to give some ideas a few extra moments of consideration. Here's how I broke one of my drawer slides and had to buy more. When measuring exactly how wide my drawer fronts and backs needed to be, I just made them too big and cut them too wide. And so in a moment, you'll see a sped up comedy skit really of me jamming the bottom drawer in and breaking the drawer slide. Construction of the drawer boxes I stand behind, butt joints with trim head screws, I just should have learned from tip number 7 and made the drawers narrower. For the drawer faces, I'm a huge fan of insetting them about 1/8 of an inch, and this does a few things. One, it gives the cabinet some depth, which I think looks really nice. Dos, if there are any squareness issues, insetting the drawers hides that a little bit. And tre, if you try to make the drawer faces perfectly flush with the front of the cabinet, if those faces protrude even just a little bit, it can make the cabinet not look great. I got the drawer slides all installed, and I like to do the final tightening with a screwdriver so I don't strip the screws. And the top drawer actually fit pretty nicely, but the bottom drawer, well, I'll just have you eat your popcorn and watch. The next day, I made the drawers narrower with a router and got some new drawer slides. I like to use playing cards when attaching the drawer face to make sure that I get an even reveal on all 4 sides, and now I'm going to attempt to answer all the questions I generally get when I post about this technique. No, the exact number of cards I'm using here doesn't really matter and won't help you. You just need to make sure you use the same number of cards on the bottom as you do the top, and the same number of cards on each side. Yes, I know I'm not the first person to do this, but I am the second. And no, it will not work unless you use half baseball cards and half playing cards like I did here. This is the year that I'm upping my dust collection game because I want to keep my lungies nice and healthy. So I started with my miter saw, and I made a video about that process, of course, and you can check out that video after you watch this one. And now it's time to improve my table saw. So I'm cutting a hole in this back panel, which I'll attach a dust port to that goes to the specific dust collector that I just bought. I did a lot of research and decided to purchase the Rockler Dust Right 1250 CFM dust collector, which I paid full price for, because it was wall mounted, didn't take up a lot of space, has a canister attachment which filters out all the fine particles, and it has done a really good job of sucking the dust into the dust bag. I didn't want to go out and buy a professional cabinet saw, so I asked myself, how can I take the 2 features I like most about those bigger saws and put them into my job site saw? So that is why I'm building this cart, which mostly encloses the table saw to help with dust collection and includes this foldable wing to increase the cutting surface. I've used this folding hardware before and it's always worked well, so I'll put a link to this in the description. But if you end up getting the plans, there'll be a list of all the hardware that I use with links. I really like to put foldable wings on my shop furniture to save space, but I am not the only one who loves wings. Could you just leave the hole how it is on the back panel and attach a shop vac to your table saw instead of a dust collector hose? Absolutely, and it would be much better than nothing. But a dust collector really does do a much better job of collecting dust, as the name would suggest. Even with this cart, are there benefits of having a professional cabinet saw? Yes, absolutely. But they're pretty expensive, and this cart does a great job of addressing the 2 things I love most about those larger saws: the table saw enclosure and the large cutting surface. I've been adulting for a few years now, and I've come to learn that everything isn't just expensive, everything is really expensive, table saws included. So when I had the opportunity to upgrade the saw that I already have instead of paying through the nose for a new one, I took it. Our lungs are precious, and it's always best to suck up as much dust as you can at the tool. So here's how to do that on the miter saw. This is how my miter saw dust collection has been. Yeah, horrible. But with the help of this little accessory and a new space-efficient miter saw station, my lungs are a lot happier. I made some very specific and unique design choices for this miter saw station cart to make my shop feel bigger. I am in a 198 square foot shop, so building shop furniture that saves space is essential, or essential, potato tomato. Now enjoy this very good acting as I pretend to cut these boards. Wow! Now this is going to shock you, so I hope you're sitting down, but that was actually me making the sound of that saw. I wanted to show you how to make the cut with a circular saw, but a track saw just leaves such a cleaner cut, so I'll be using the track saw throughout this build. Now for a lot of dados and rabbits, but I will not bore you by making you watch all of the cuts. And the key to a great dado is a perfect fit. This was a little loose, so I adjusted my dado stack and made another test cut, and this fit is much better, although it was a big mistake making it this perfect snug fit, but I'll get to that later in the video. I put painter's tape on my plywood before cutting the dados and rabbits, and it made a difference and there was less tear out. Was it a huge difference? No, but I always strive to make my projects as nice as possible, even if they're shop projects. I have been really neglecting my lungs so far as a woodworker, but I decided this year to change that. It's really easy to not prioritize dust collection when starting out because, at least in my head, the dust collection did not affect how good the furniture turned out in the end. That, along with the fact that dust collectors can be expensive and tools that have better dust collection are generally more expensive than tools with worse dust collection. I dry assembled this cabinet, meaning I assembled it without glue, on the same day that I cut those dados and rabbits, and that's an important fact to remember. And I am so happy because it went together so smoothly, but all that is going to change very soon. All this talk of proper dust collection, and I still have nothing on my track saw to collect the dust, and the dust still goes everywhere when I use it, but that is on my list of things to fix. Now that I know the exact dimensions that my upper and lower dividers need to be, I'm cutting those to their final dimensions, and now it is time to prep the cabinet for the glue up. Buckle up, people. I'll talk about why these pieces did not fit together well at all in a minute, but I first want to take you through some of the techniques that I busted out during this final assembly. These moves are pretty advanced, so make sure you've warmed up and stretched properly before utilizing them. First we have what I'm calling the closed fist pound. Then there's the open palm slap, followed by the hammer. And lastly, my personal favorite, the stomp. So what happened here? Well, I cut these dados 2 days ago, and what I didn't know is even over the course of just a couple days, dados can swell and your pieces which once fit perfectly do not fit anymore. I didn't know this and I've never had this issue in the past, but in the future, I'm going to make sure to assemble my cabinet on the same day that I cut my dados and rabbits to avoid this issue altogether. I actually felt really bad because I told my wife I would be inside in 30 minutes tops to help with the kids, and then 2 hours later, I'm still in the shop struggling with this cabinet. Here's another tip. If your lumberyard has a plywood product that is way cheaper than the other stuff they sell, which was the case with this piece of 1/4-inch plywood, don't buy it. The veneer was more like tissue paper than actual wood. It was unsandable and I had some issues with tear out. Other than it being absolutely horrible, it was actually pretty good. I attached the back panel to the cabinet using glue and a bunch of brad nails, which I hammered in by hand, and I don't have a nail gun because I don't use it enough to justify the purchase, and it's actually kind of fun to hammer in all those nails. Because I'm in a small shop, I need all of my shop furniture to be on wheels so that I can move them around as needed. I got 3-inch lockable casters, and you'll see in a little bit that these rolled around pretty dang smooth. Sorry for the language. But it's not the mobility that makes this cabinet pretty cool. It's the fact that I decided to attach foldable wings for cutting down long pieces of lumber. Sometimes I have long hardwood, and a huge miter saw station just isn't in the cards with the size of my shop. So I'm making 2 foldable wings that fold up when I need to cut long pieces of lumber and then fold down and out of the way when I'm not using my miter saw. When I started woodworking, I was under the impression that you needed to have a fence on your miter saw station. The woodworkers on YouTube said you need a fence to cut square pieces of wood. You need a fence to attach a stop block. And like the great horse I once knew named Geronimo, I say nay. In my opinion, the fence can just get in the way, and it actually can affect the squareness of your cut if it's not lined up perfectly. Oh, but don't you worry. I'll be adding something to these wings which will make it possible, and actually very easy, to attach a stop block for repeatable cuts. If you want to build what I'm calling the king-size miter saw station, and you don't want to have to figure out all the measurements and dimensions yourself, I have created detailed written and video plans for this build. Just go to thomascustomwoodworks.com, or you can click the link in the description below. I've designed the plans in a way that a beginner can build this no problem, and this miter saw station can be adaptable to pretty much any miter saw. I decided to put T-track in each of the wings so that I can use a stop block easily when making repeatable cuts. And I found that I use a stop block quite a bit because oftentimes when I'm building something, there are many components that need to be the exact same length. You probably saw, but I got some wobble on my router because I put the plywood on the wrong side of the router on my initial cuts, and then I moved the plywood to be on the left side of the router, which is where it should have been the entire time. So what else am I doing to save my lungs from fine wood dust? Well, I just got a new 1250 CFM dust collector, and I may do a video on it after I've had it a while, which I don't typically do, but let me know in the comments if you like watching tool review videos. I've used drawer slides before, and they're fine, they're cool, but I wanted to make some drawers that don't require that I buy more drawer slides. There are so many ways to make drawers, and I've made drawers a bunch of ways, but this way is really nice because it doesn't require drawer slides or a drawer face to go on top of the drawer front, so it requires less hardware and less plywood. I'm sneaking up on this rabbet, and I'm using a stop block so that all the rest of the rabbets on the drawer fronts and drawer backs can be the exact same width. As I just said, there are so many different ways to make drawers, and there's so many different ways to do anything in woodworking, especially joinery. So how do you know when to use one technique over another, or when to use one type of joinery over another when you're making a project or designing a project? I have the same advice when people ask me what tool they should get next. I tell them, pick a project first, and then buy the tool or tools needed to build that project. Pick a project and then try a joinery method, and after you build more and more things, you'll be able to figure out what joinery you like best and what works best for certain projects. For shop projects, I'll use pocket holes a lot when I know that they won't be visible because I think they're ugly. Another question that I get quite a bit is what plywood do I use? And I use birch plywood a lot, and I'm using it here because it's affordable and I really like the grain patterns that are on it. Let's talk music for a second. One of my favorite bands is... A lot of people use Bloom door hinges, and I've used them before and they worked really well, but I wanted to try a slightly cheaper option, so I got these hinges online, and the company is Burda, and they worked really great.
All right, let's see how these doors fit. Hey, looks pretty good. All right, what's behind door number 2? 1, 2. It's not bad either. Nice 1/8 reveal all the way around. That actually looks pretty good.
This video is not sponsored and there will be no affiliate links in the description. I just like to share what products I've used that work well. I have a list of all the hardware and accessories that I've used in the written plans for this build, but if you don't want to buy the plans, that's totally fine. Just comment below any questions that you have about this build, and I'm happy to share everything that I've used. Here is how I've made this miter saw station adaptable to pretty much any saw, regardless of the table height of the saw. I'm clamping a flat piece of wood on my miter saw, in this case a piece of plywood, and then I'm lining up the foldable wing so that the top of the wing is flush with the plywood. This ensures that no matter what miter saw is being attached to the station, the wings will be in perfect alignment. This build is nice and mobile, the wings are all well and great, the dust collection is going to be a huge upgrade, which I'll get to in a little bit. But what if I don't want to take out my measuring tape every time I want to cut a piece of lumber to a specific length? I can't remember where I saw this, but I saw it somewhere and I thought it was so cool. So this will make measuring my work pieces a breeze. Okay, this part of the build gets me giddy because I'm so excited about it. I will be putting a shop vac in the lower right-hand compartment of the cabinet to help with dust collection. And because I'll have a shop vac in there, I need to drill a hole for the hose and for the cord, and then some ventilation holes because it will be enclosed with a door. But you may be saying to yourself, attaching a shop vac hose to your miter saw station doesn't really help with dust collection that much. Well, it does if you get a new dust port that was made specifically for your miter saw. Okay, this is so freaking cool. And I will provide a non-affiliate link to this product in the description because it works so well and I don't get any money for saying this. Travis over at Shop Nation designs and 3D prints different dust ports for different miter saws, which significantly improves the dust collection for those miter saws. I got this one for my Bosch GCM 12SD miter saw, and it has greatly improved the dust collection. I'm trying to figure out what you're supposed to do when you're on fire again. You come for the woodworking and you stay for the dad jokes. Please don't leave. This stop block was really easy to make. I just took some wood, I used white oak because I had it lying around, and I cut a groove in the middle so that I can attach a star knob. Okay, I think it's time to see what this bad boy can do. Yes, having tools with better dust collection and getting a dust collector costs money, but I would really recommend not waiting as long as I did to improve the dust collection in your shop. Even if you only do a handful of projects each year, you only get one set of lungs, so take care of them. This really unique workbench has given me so much more space in the shop and has greatly improved my workflow. I've cut all 4 of my tabletop frame pieces a little long so I have a little wiggle room when I'm cutting the miters. I'm going to cut a miter on one side of all 4 of the tabletop frame pieces, and then when I cut the 45-degree miter on the other side of each piece, that's when I'll cut those pieces to their exact lengths. Now that I have all my tabletop frame pieces cut, I'll glue and clamp them all together. I'll be using these 8-inch 90-degree clamp squares. It just makes the glue up go a lot smoother and ensures that every piece is at 90 degrees. After clamping the pieces together, I'll recess 2 screws into each long frame piece. Then I'll hide those screws with dowels that are 3/8 of an inch. Next, I'm recessing some 2.5-inch pocket hole screws to attach the tabletop frame to the tabletop. Okay, it is time for me to cut this tabletop support piece to size, and I'll secure it to the tabletop frame using recessed 2.5-inch construction screws. I'll secure this exactly in the middle of my tabletop, and I'll hide the screws on both ends with some 3/8-inch dowels. This workbench was just too cool not to make plans for, so I created written and video plans, and if you want to check them out, just click the link in the description, and I really do pride myself in the quality of my plans. To make the notches in these lower leg support pieces, I'm using my table saw and just my regular blade. I'll make multiple passes until I have a notch that's 1 5/8 deep and 1.5 wide. You'll see what this notch is for later in the build, but it's for the lower support stretcher. The long additional leg piece does not need to be flush with the top of the leg when you glue it up, because you'll be cutting that flush when the glue dries. Then I'm cutting all the legs to their final length on the miter saw using a stop block so that each leg can be the exact same length. Then I'll drill my hole near the top of each leg piece, and this hole is where the screw is going to go into. Then I'm rounding the top of each leg piece, and this will allow the legs to fold up and out when complete. Next, I'm drilling a hole 3/8 of an inch into the side of the tabletop frame, and I'll use each leg as a guide. Then I'll attach each leg with a bolt, 2 washers, and a nut. To attach the lower leg support pieces, those are the pieces with the slot cut out of them, I'm going to use glue and some screws. I'll recess those screws and then I'll hide them with dowels. The upper leg support piece, the piece without the notch cut out, will be attached using glue and recessed screws. I'll also hide those screws with dowels. This piece is important because it's going to act as a stopper to make sure the legs are at exactly 90 degrees. I'm cutting a notch out of both ends of this stretcher that is 1 5/8 inches by 1.5 inches. But remember, don't just go off of these measurements. Measure how big the notches need to be exactly based on the workbench that you've just built. I'm using hardwood edge banding to cover the plywood edges on my tabletop because it'll make my workbench look just a little bit nicer. I'm using 4/4 alder, which is actually 3/4 of an inch, and I'm cutting 1/4 inch strips using glue and a lot of tape to adhere it to the edges of the tabletop, and then cutting off the excess with my router and a flush trim bit. Okay, I'm getting ready to cut the wall mounts for the workbench. I'm cutting the top and bottom pieces to their final dimensions using the table saw and the miter saw. Then I'm making some marks on the bottom piece so I know exactly where to drill the holes when I attach it into the studs on the wall. For the bottom piece, I'm cutting a notch along the entire length of it that will be 13/16 of an inch by 1/4 inch. I'm using my regular blade for this and I'm not messing with the dado stack just because it'll be a little quicker if I keep my regular blade in there. Perfect. Okay. Woo! Success. There is one thing that people who build anything really focus on. And because of that, some other things that I think are really important don't get focused on enough. And I'm going to talk about those things in this video, which has really improved my life and the way I work. I'm building a shelving unit for my garage workshop, and I'm going to add additional storage, which I haven't seen done online yet. Now, that doesn't mean it hasn't been done, it just means I haven't seen it. Now, did you notice how horrible the dust collection is on my miter saw? And I know I don't have a shop vac hooked up to it, but this miter saw isn't very conducive to hooking up a shop vac. And I'm going to fix that dust collection, and spoiler alert, it involves getting rid of this saw. So what do I think people focus on way too much when they start out woodworking and using power tools? I think too much fear is given to the table saw blade and cutting off fingers on the table saw. Now let me be clear, the table saw is dangerous and all safety precautions should be taken before and during using the table saw. But I feel like too many times I've heard people are scared to start building or woodworking because they're nervous about using power tools and specifically the table saw. If you learn how to use the table saw properly, take all safety precautions, and are alert and not distracted while using the saw, your chances of getting injured are extremely low. And there is one thing that I think should be focused on more than it is, and if you've watched my content before, you can probably guess what it is. One shelf structure built, 4 to go, but I won't bore you with how I built those because it's the exact same process. So now I'm cutting spacers on the miter saw so that when I attach the legs to the shelves, the spacing can be perfect. I'm just using screws to attach the legs to the shelves, and I ended up having to take some screws out because when I tried to attach the second shelf, the legs didn't really line up, but it was a really simple fix. What I have been focusing on the past 2 years, and what I think more people should have in the forefront of their mind if they have any sort of workspace or workshop, is storage and space efficiency. This is going to have a lot of storage because it will have 5 shelves, but I'm going to add even more storage to this unit by adding a French cleat wall. And if you don't know what a French cleat is, you are in for a treat. Can you figure out what I'm doing wrong here? There I am being silly, but that's not the only time I will be a silly goose in this project. I am in a one-car garage workshop, so space is at a premium. So every time I build furniture like this, I need to maximize my space and maximize the storage capabilities. That is why I built a miter saw station that has foldable wings, why I have a flip-top tool cart that holds 2 large power tools, why I have a folding workbench, and why here I'm adding a French cleat wall to this shelving unit that already has a lot of storage. I'm securing this shelving unit to the wall so there is no chance that it falls over because I have 2 young kids and eventually they may climb on this when I am not looking. A lot of garages have a cement step, mine included, and although I have done zero research onto why that cement step is there, I need to cut the back legs so that this will fit flush against the wall. But if you know why that cement step is there, please let me know in the comments. You would think that after I mark exactly where this step lines up with the back legs and I cut those legs exactly to that line, that all 4 legs would sit perfectly level with the ground, but you would be wrong. I don't normally wear gloves when I work on my woodworking projects, but a company sent me some gloves, so periodically you will see me wearing gloves like I am here when building this project and securing it to the wall. And it was actually really nice. Will I wear gloves in the future? Probably not, but for this project it kept the splinties out of my fingies. I'm excited to see how many people stop watching the video after that little phrase, but even though the legs didn't line up perfectly with the ground, I just cut 2 little pieces of wood and glued them to the bottom of the front legs, and it was a very simple fix. Okay, we've made it to the French cleat wall, and I'm really excited to build this and put this on the shelving unit because it's going to give me a ton more storage space. The French cleat system is basically one piece of wood with a 45-degree angle secured to a wall and a matching piece with a 45-degree angle secured to a tool holder, and it's a great way to hold tools and accessories very securely. Let me know if you think I need a brad nailer, but it was actually oddly satisfying to hammer in all these nails. And in a few minutes, you'll see how I make the tool holders for 2 specific accessories that I have in my shop, and it was really nice to be able to make holders for my exact needs. I have written and video plans for this DIY shelving unit. Just go to thomascustomwoodworks.com or I'll have a link in the description below if you're interested. Let's see if you can figure out what I'm doing wrong as I secure this French cleat wall to the unit.
So there's a reason that the middle screws were not digging into the wood, and that is because there's nothing behind the plywood for them to dig into. I was being silly.
One strategy I use fairly often when gluing pieces together, especially small pieces like this, is using CA glue and wood glue together. I'm putting wood glue and CA glue on the piece and then spraying accelerator on the matching piece. So when I put those pieces together, the CA glue dries in about 20 seconds and acts as a clamp so I can keep working on the piece and don't have to wait hours while the wood glue dries. This holder is for the different thicknesses and colors of CA glue I have. And let me know if you think I used enough screws on this piece. I really don't think I did. I probably could have fit in a few more for extra security. I'm securing the matching 45-degree angle piece to the back of this holder, and this is what's going to hook into the French cleat wall. I'm next going to be making a holder for my micro jig gripper, and then off camera I'll make holders for my lathe tools so that they'll be more easily accessible when I use my lathe. And that's the great thing about the French cleat wall, is you can customize it to your needs and the tools and accessories you have in your shop. Respect your power tools, but don't be afraid of them, and always strive to improve your storage and maximize your space. I have two power tools, and I needed some way to put them in my shop without taking up too much space. So I decided to build this. My shop is in a one-car garage space, which I realize is bigger than a lot of people's shops. Even so, I need to come up with ways to make the most of the space that I have. Now, this build starts out like your normal everyday shop cart. I'm using pocket hole screws and glue to attach the bottom to the sides. It will have a shelf and a drawer for storage and a tabletop. And it is customary for a small shopper like myself to put everything on lockable casters. But if you've been following my channel for a while, you know that pretty much everything I build has a little twist to save space. I'm attaching this shelf the same way I attached the bottom piece, with 5 pocket hole screws on each side. This opening is where the lone drawer will be, but it'll be plenty of storage for what we need. To make sure I cut my drawer front and drawer back to the exact lengths that I need, I'm putting 2 3/4 inch pieces of plywood and both drawer slides in the drawer opening. The space left over will be the lengths that my drawer front and back need to be. I make my drawers pretty simple. I cut the drawer front, drawer back, and the drawer sides to their final lengths and dimensions. And then I cut a 1/4 inch groove near the bottom of each of these pieces to where my 1/4 inch drawer bottom will go. I always dry fit my drawer boxes first, just to see if I need to make any final adjustments before I put this together permanently with glue and screws. For this drawer box, I'm using glue first and then clamping it together, letting it dry for about 30 minutes before I put in the screws. I've just found that this method does a great job of making sure everything is perfectly square before I put this drawer box together permanently with screws. No build of mine is complete without at least a few mistakes, and this project is no exception. What I should have done is recess the screws for the drawer box, but since I'm a silly goose, I did not, and when I put in the screws, it split the plywood just a little bit. Here I'm just attaching some drawer slides to the drawer box and then to the cabinet, and if you want a more detailed step-by-step guide on how I did this, I'll put a link in the description to another video that I made on attaching drawer slides. I made a pretty significant career shift recently, which I'll go into in detail in a future video, but this means I'll be spending a lot more time woodworking and creating content for you. Also part of that shift is focusing more on selling my woodworking plans in my Etsy store. I know I say I make some mistakes when building projects, and I do, but for my plans, I make sure they are absolutely perfect before they go in my Etsy store and before anyone purchases them. If you think this cart will be beneficial to your workshop or want to check out any of my other build plans, I'll put a link to all of them in my description. Is it a little scary that more of my income will be based on woodworking? Yes, but I am really excited to be able to create more content that I think will really help people. Okay, I'm really happy how these drawer pulls turned out, and I'm attaching them with wood glue, CA glue, and screws, so I don't even think Dwayne Johnson can pull these off. Okay, now we're getting to some really fun parts. Attaching the tabletop. I'm now drilling a 3/4 inch hole in the side of my cabinet, and this is where the 3/4 inch steel tube will go. Why is there a steel tube in my tabletop? Well, my friends, you are about to see. I'm cutting my 3/4 inch steel tube to its final length, and then I need to make sure that I'm putting this tube in the exact center of my first tabletop piece. Now, since this tabletop is going to hold 2 power tools, it needs to be thick and girthy. I'm making it like a sandwich. There's going to be 2 3/4 inch bigger plywood pieces that will act as the bread, and then all these little pieces will be like the meat. In the end, this tabletop will be 2 1/4 inches thick. Because I can't use clamps to attach this centerpiece, I'm using screws as my clamp. Once the glue dries, I'll take the screws out, and because these pieces will be hidden, no one will even know these holes are there. I'm drilling a hole near each corner of the cabinet sides, and this will be to secure the tabletop with star knobs. Because I'm just one lone man in my shop, I'm using my drawer to help me attach my tabletop. I worked really hard to make sure everything lined up perfectly, so putting the steel tube through the cabinet sides and the tabletop wasn't too tough. Exactly how is this cart going to hold 2 power tools? Well, you may have guessed it at this point, but each side of the tabletop is going to hold 1 power tool. And then, when you want to use each power tool, you'll just rotate the tabletop until the power tool you want to use is on the top. These fun little pieces will act as steel tube stoppers to make sure the steel tube sits in the right spot at all times. The 2 tools that will call this cart home are my rigid oscillating spindle / belt sander and my DeWalt 735 planer. Now, this cart is really cool for a number of reasons, and I'm super excited to have it in my shop. But my favorite part about it might be how I'm organizing the power cords. I got these robe hooks at the home center, and I'm attaching 2 to each side of the tabletop, and I'll be able to wrap my cords neatly around them. I made some bonehead mistakes on this clamp rack, which cost me time and money because I didn't have a plan. The clamp rack I have now has served its purpose for several years, but it's not working for me very well anymore because although it's great at holding F-style clamps and trigger clamps, it's not great at holding parallel clamps, bar clamps, and pipe clamps. Usually, before I build anything in my wood shop, I first build it in a 3D modeling software called SketchUp so I can see the dimensions, how it's going to look, and how it's going to go together. But because I thought this would be such an easy build, I decided not to make plans first because I thought there's no need, and boy was I wrong. As you would have guessed, this did not go as planned. These triangle pieces will be the clamp rack holders, the pieces actually holding the clamps, and I'm building this rack in a way where it will hold parallel clamps and pipe clamps specifically really securely, though it will do a great job at holding trigger clamps and F-style clamps as well. You're about to see the first mistake that I made by not creating this build in SketchUp first, and by the end of this project, I will have made enough mistakes where I had to buy an additional 4 foot by 8 foot 3/4 inch piece of plywood for this project, and that's an extra $85 where I live. So I got all the pieces cut and I decided to put it all together, and I'm really glad I did because I don't love how it looks. The clamp holders protrude out farther than the ends, and it just looks a little off. So I'm going to change the design of the ends, and it should make it look a lot better. Mistakes happen, no big deal. I'll just cut another 2 pieces that will be the ends of the clamp rack, and there should be no more mistakes in this project, right? Okay, I remade the clamp rack ends, and they're better, but as you can see, the clamp holders still stick out farther than the bottom of the ends because I mismeasured. I did not take into account the 3/4 inch plywood that's the back of the clamp rack. And I am out of plywood, so I'll need to wait till tomorrow to get some more so I can remake these clamp rack ends for the 3rd time. Now, usually I create all my plans in SketchUp, which is a 3D modeling program, so these things don't really happen, and if they do happen, they're very minor. But I didn't do that for this project because I thought it was just going to be a quick build and I wouldn't need to make a 3D rendering of it. But I should have definitely modeled it in SketchUp first, and I've wasted kind of a lot of plywood making these mistakes. But they're good learning experiences, and this clamp rack should be done tomorrow. This first clamp rack end that I'm cutting, I'm using a circular saw and a straight edge because I want to show you how you can cut these pieces with a circular saw and you don't need to buy a track saw. With that being said, the track saw is quicker to set up, can be more accurate, and leaves a much cleaner cut. I also used a circular saw for that first cut because I'm making plans for this build and I want these plans to be accessible to as many people as possible, and I'm aware that a lot of people don't have track saws, and that's totally fine. You can get the job done with a circular saw and a straight edge. One thing that saved me a lot of time is making 2 extra clamp holders. I was being a dumbo and I split 2 of the clamp holder pieces because I used a screw that was longer than the drill bit I used to drill the pilot hole. But it was no big deal because I had made 2 extra clamp rack holder pieces. And you may be wondering, why didn't you save that lumber and use it to make 2 extra clamp rack ends? Well, that plywood was too narrow, so it would not have worked for the clamp rack ends. In a little bit, you'll see me take down the clamp rack that I have up now, and it was a little more laborious than it could have been because I definitely sacrificed function for looks. I'm a big believer that you don't need a lot of expensive, fancy power tools to build things, and if you've noticed, I have only used 4 power tools in this entire build. I've made detailed written and video plans for this build, which I'm calling the Ultimate Clamp Rack, and I apologize for not coming up with a better name, but I have worked out all the hiccups as you've seen so that you don't have to. This next and last mistake you're about to see is really bad, and after you see it, you're going to lose some respect for me, and that's okay because I have as well. Woodworkers as a species tend to overbuild things, and that was the case here. I thought it would look nice to put a thin strip of plywood to act as a cap on the bottom of the clamp rack. Reasonable enough, right? Not so much. If I would have kept this piece here, it would have limited the amount of space I would have to put clamps on this clamp rack. It would hold 5 less parallel clamps and 10 less F-style clamps. Yeah, bonehead move. Luckily, I panic removed it when I realized the mistake, but unfortunately, I didn't have the camera on to record my distress. When I built this clamp rack, I hid the front screws with walnut dowels, which is why I had to cut off the front with this jigsaw, but I regret nothing. The walnut dowels looked so sweet. If you take one thing from this video, it should be that planning is important. Financial planning, family planning, but most importantly, well above those trivial things I just mentioned, plan before you build a woodworking storage solution. As you can see, I'm alone, all alone, so I needed to secure this to the studs in the wall by myself, which is why I preset these screws to make securing this a lot easier. This clamp rack can hold 20 to 40 clamps depending on the type, and the top can act as a nice little shelf to put stuff if I want. It's good to have options. Always remember to be kind and be awesome, and I'll see you in this next video. This station filled the need I had been, well, needing for a while now. I tried out some new techniques and learned a scary lesson about table saw safety. You'll see what I mean in a bit. This is a station that's going to house my drills, drill bits, sander, sanding discs, and a whole heck of a lot more. I previously had a sanding disc holder and then another cabinet where I put my drills and my drill accessories, but I wanted to build something where everything can be in one spot. Building all the furniture for my workshop has been a real, please forgive me for the cliche, journey, and it's finally coming to a close, kind of, maybe. This is actually the last piece of shop furniture that I needed to build for my workshop, at least for now. The thing with shop furniture is it's a lot of fun to build, and my needs may change in the future, causing me to build some more, which would be totally fine with me because I love building that type of furniture and I'd get to share it all with you. I'm using my table saw to cut most of these pieces to size, but some of these pieces, like the shelves, I'm making a little long and then I'll cut those to their final dimensions later in the build. Although there's some new methods that I'm trying out in this build, I'm using the tried and true method of dados and rabbets. This is actually one of my favorite ways to join pieces together, especially in shop projects, because once you cut all the dados and rabbets, it's like putting together a really simple puzzle at the end, and everything should go together really nicely. I like using this joinery method for shop projects specifically because although it's really easy to do, the joinery doesn't look the best at the end. It doesn't look terrible, but if I was using this joinery method for, let's say, a bookcase for my house, I would probably hide the dados and rabbets with some edge banding. Because this project has a lot of rabbets and dados, let's speed through it a little faster. Okay, that was a lot. Now the way I made these drill and driver holders actually worked out really well. I used a 1 3/4 inch Forstner bit and drilled 2 holes into my bottom cabinet piece. Then I drew a line from the side of each hole to the front of the bottom piece, and then used my jigsaw to cut out the excess that I'm marking with my pencil here. This was really satisfying and it gave me some practice staying on the line when using my jigsaw. One of the big driving factors in building out my shop, surprisingly, has not been workflow, it's been organization over everything. My shop is only 198 square feet, not 200 square feet, I want to make that clear. So building my shop furniture and placing my tools for workflow wouldn't make much sense because I'm pretty much always 3 to 5 steps away from anything in my shop at all times. So even if where I put my tools is bad for my workflow, it doesn't really cost me any time. Where I benefit the most is equipping everything I build in my shop with lots and lots of storage. For some things, I use drawers and doors to keep things out of sight. For this station, I kept everything open so everything's really accessible. Like my sandpaper and my drills and my drill bits and my router bits. I grabbed those a lot, and so I didn't want to have to open doors and try and figure out where things are when I need to use them. Everything's open so I can just grab and use them really quickly. Okay, now that this is in clamps and the glue is drying, it's time to cut the middle shelves to their final dimensions. I waited until the cabinet was in clamps so I knew exactly how wide these shelves needed to be. After I cut these to the perfect sizes, I secured them to the cabinet with wood glue. These shelves actually fit really snug, so I probably didn't need to use glue, but I generally do to make sure nothing goes anywhere, except I guess for some shelves that I put in this very cabinet later in the build. Okay, let me explain. I didn't use any glue when securing the sanding disc shelves later in the build because they fit pretty snug and I didn't want to have to deal with any messy squeeze out towards the end of the project. Okay, here is where I got humbled by the table saw. You're about to see some kickback in just a second, and I'm actually really glad I got it on camera so I could talk about what I did wrong. Yep, that happened. What I failed to do here was push the workpiece all the way through the table saw. The wood got trapped between the blade and the rip fence, and the spinning blade shot the wood back through my wall as you just saw. Luckily, I know enough about using the table saw that I wasn't standing directly behind the workpiece. Because if you watch that clip again, there are a couple of reasons why that would have been really, really bad. Okay, where do I stand on pocket holes? Absolutely love them, especially for shop projects like this when you're not going to see them. Am I going to use them for some heirloom hardwood furniture? Probably not, because I think they're a little ugly and the wood's going to move, but for a lot of applications, these are a great, great option. For some reason, I didn't hook up my dust collection for these cuts, so this is a good reminder to always hook up your dust collection, even if you're wearing a mask like I was. These shelves I'm using for the 6-inch sanding discs that I will have hopefully soon. For the past 3 years, I've been using a 5-inch sander, but I made these slots 6¼ inches wide because hopefully in the near future, I'm going to get the Festool ETS 150, which takes 6-inch sanding discs. My Black & Decker sander gets the job done, and I think it was about $30 if I'm not mistaken when I bought it. But it is time for an upgrade because the dust collection is absolutely horrid on it. So the plan is to get the new sander with a Festool dust extractor because I only have one set of lungs and I want to be nice to them. And I know people either love or hate Festool, and I'm pretty neutral, but I've heard their sanders are exceptional, and since these will be my first tools from them, I'm pretty excited about it. Okay, I'm using a French cleat to hang up this cabinet, and it was actually really easy. This was my first time using this method to secure a cabinet on the wall, and I'm going to be doing it a lot in the future. All you do is you take one piece of wood, cut it roughly in half on your table saw at a 45-degree angle, secure one piece to your cabinet and one piece to the wall, and boom, you've got a French cleat. So I'm not great at a lot of things. I don't know how to drive stick shift. My singing voice could be described as abysmal at best, except when I'm in the shower. But one thing I have discovered I am pretty great at is making plans on how to build furniture. Each project comes with written and video plans, and if you're interested in learning how to build this project in more detail or checking out any of my other plans, I'll put a link in the description. The video plans go in much, much more detail than the one you're watching now, and the written plans are simple yet very thorough. Here's another build that I know you're going to really, really like. This was the third space-saving workbench I built for my shop, but it was much needed. And well, I did it for you. Let me explain. I'm cutting the tabletop into 2 pieces, which generally you're not supposed to do on workbenches, but for this one it works. Having built 2 similar workbenches in the past, I figured out what has worked well and what needs to be improved, and I'm hoping to deliver on all that here. I always like my shop furniture to look nice also, so I'm adding this white oak border to the tabletop, and yes, it will look good, but it also serves a very practical purpose, which you'll see towards the end of the video. Since I don't have any clamps long enough for this step, I'm doubling and even tripling up on some of the clamps to make it work. Because I make plans for all of the shop furniture that I build, this workbench included, I always try and keep costs down so that the people that buy my plans don't have to spend an arm and a leg when they build it. And cost was especially at the forefront of my mind on this build. So the tabletop is just one 2-foot by 4-foot sheet of plywood, and the base just requires 6 2x4s. I'm using a stop block with my miter saw to cut all 4 legs to their final lengths, and using a stop block ensures that all the legs will be the exact same length and I don't have to measure each one. Another thing I'm trying to do with this workbench is make it as light as possible, so for the legs and the horizontal leg support pieces, I'm using a half lap joint so the leg structures will be just 1.5 inches thick. I'm using the leg support pieces as a measuring tool so I can get the exact width that the half laps need to be. Now, the other 2 workbenches I made were not too heavy, but I just wanted to make this one as light as possible while still being very sturdy so that it's really easy to move around in the shop. Now, this is going to be a folding workbench, so keeping this as light as possible is just going to make it that much easier to fold the legs in and fold the tabletop down when the workbench is not in use. I'm sneaking up on the final cut so that this can be a snug fit. I don't want it to be too loose when I'm assembling it. A really nice thing about having a folding workbench is, yes, I have so much more room for activities, but also I have a lot of room to assemble large furniture pieces in my workshop. I can fold up the bench, put it off to the side, and I have a lot of room for assembly, and I don't have to assemble a larger furniture piece in the driveway like I've had to do before. I'm cutting a notch out on these lower leg support pieces because in a little bit I will be putting another piece which will prevent the workbench legs from folding in inadvertently. Realistically, the chances of the legs folding in are very, very low, especially because I'll have some tabletop latches installed, but this will also keep the workbench a little sturdier as well. Now I get to put some of these pieces together and assemble these leg structures, and it's really nice to see part of this workbench coming together. Because I'm a woodworker and I overbuild everything, I'm securing these legs together using glue and screws. Just glue or just screws would probably be fine, but I want to make sure that these legs will stay together in an earthquake. And because I also don't like the look of exposed screws most of the time, a little weird thing that I have, I'm hiding those screws with dowels. Will these dowels match the wood or even the grain of the legs? No. But I actually think the contrast of the dowels to the legs looks pretty cool. Okay, we have the tabletop built, we have the leg structures put together. Now it's time to build the workbench base, and don't worry, this base will be very sturdy because of triangles. I cut the long pieces to their final lengths, and now I'm going to use pocket holes to assemble these pieces together. At the beginning of the video, I only showed myself cutting 4 legs on the miter saw to the exact same lengths. I actually cut 6 legs because 2 of those legs are shown here and they will be the legs of the workbench base. It'll make more sense in a little bit when you see it, but I need to build this base so that I can then secure the workbench leg structures to this base using hinges so that the legs can fold in and out. Ooh, that makes me crave an In-N-Out burger right now. Okay, stay on track, Thomas. I am using a diagonal cross brace for this base, so that rhymes, so that I can produce triangles, which is the strongest shape and will keep this workbench from wobbling. I did this in one of my other folding workbench builds, and I didn't really know why it kept the workbench so much more sturdy than just a horizontal brace. And so I asked for people to explain it to me in the comments, and they gave me some great explanations. Again, just screws would be just fine here, but classic Thomas, I'm going for the glue and screw method for the earthquake. If you were excited about the leg structures getting assembled, oh boy, you are going to go nuts for this. I'm attaching the leg structures to the workbench base using hinges, and now you'll finally get to see how the folding mechanism works. The legs fold, yay! These latch blocks are going to end up being really important, but now it's time to allow the workbench tabletop to fold. 6 hinges on the small tabletop piece, and yeah, that might be a couple more than I need, but I really wanted to make sure I could do anything I want on this bench. Now, if you have a router and don't want there to be a little gap when you put the large tabletop piece and the small tabletop piece together on the base, you can route out an area for the middle of this hinge to go. Then you could put both tabletop pieces right next to each other and there will be no gap. But you will have to route a chamfer on the inside edge of both the small tabletop piece and the large tabletop piece, otherwise it won't be able to fold. Remember when I was all like, oh, I hate exposed screws are the worst. Well, I'm gonna have some exposed screws here on the small tabletop piece because really I just didn't want to take the time to hide them with dowels, and I have these gray screws that actually look fine. So there'll be exposed screws here, they'll look good, and we're gonna move on. I am calling this workbench the lightweight folding workbench. Very creative, I know. But if you think it should be called something different, let me know in the comments. If I'm being honest, it is very unlikely I will change the name, but I still want to hear your ideas. All right, fold, there we go. If you're wondering why I sound a little more excited than I probably should that the tabletop folds correctly, it is because in woodworking, mistakes are made all the time. And in every project that I build, I make multiple mistakes. Some are major, some are minor, and I'm just excited that no major mistakes have been made on this project yet. This is the support piece I was talking about earlier that will fit in those notches, and this will keep the legs nice and stable. So what did I mean when at the beginning of the video I said I built this workbench for you? Well, I know that nowadays it can cost a lot of money to build anything. I also know that a lot of people don't have a ton of space in their workshops or crafting areas. So here I have the lightweight folding workbench, which is small enough to fit in almost any workshop, does not take a lot of materials to build, keeping the cost down, is lightweight, mobile, and folds up and out of the way when not in use. I already have 2 workbenches. I don't need a third, but I thought this workbench would help a lot of people, so I thought I'd build it and show you. I'm not going to hide the fact that I do sell plans for this workbench, and it was a good business decision to create this plan, but it does make me feel good that I can provide value to people in a small space. Let me know what you think about this folding workbench idea, and remember, be kind, be awesome. Today I'm building a cabinet that's actually affordable and fits in a small workspace. And I may have run into some hiccups along the way.
Oh, are you kidding me?
Being in a small garage workshop, it forces me to get creative with a lot of the things I build, namely how to save space. And when I saw a little nook that needed a piece of furniture, I thought, great, I can build a fun-sized cabinet that can fit that space perfectly. For the toe kick of the cabinet, I decided to use a router on one side and then use that side as a template for the other side so that they could be mirror images of each other. There are so many ways to make cabinets and so many ways to make toe kicks. One popular way that I've seen is to make a separate base and then put the cabinet, which is a little deeper, on top of that base so you have a toe kick built in. I went with this method because I found it to be a little simpler and this cabinet is so small that I thought this way would work great. I cut just one dado in this whole cabinet and that's where the bottom will go, and then I'm cutting some rabbets on the side pieces and the top piece where the plywood back will go. One thing that I found really helpful when I'm building anything is using referential measurements, meaning you're referencing your project and then cutting the pieces to size. You're not cutting all the pieces to a certain length and width at the beginning of the project. That is a recipe for your pieces not fitting very well. I used to think that base cabinets had to be giant and look like this, or even this, but with the space I have available in my workshop, those sizes aren't really possible. What I can do, however, is build a smaller single base cabinet that fits in a small workshop and has lots of storage. And if you want to build one yourself, I've made detailed written and video plans for this build, and you'll find the link to those plans in the description. Putting tape on the inside edges while I'm doing the glue up does help, especially if the tape doesn't rip as you're pulling it off, but it makes cleaning up that glue squeeze out really easy. Here's a lumber buying tip if you go to a local lumber yard to get your plywood. I just discovered this at my local lumber yard when I told them I was building some shop projects. Ask if they have some reject plywood. This is plywood that has defects or imperfections, and in my case, depending on the thickness, this plywood costs me 40 to 60% less. I'm measuring the back of the cabinet to see just how wide and long I need to cut the back plywood, and I'm using my circular saw for the first cut, and because it doesn't leave the edge very nice, I'm using my track saw for all other cuts because that leaves a really nice edge. So why did I even make one cut with the circular saw? Well, I wanted to show you all how to cut down a larger piece of plywood to size, but if you're able to get a track saw, it's easier to set up and it leaves a nicer edge, but it's by no means necessary. A circular saw will get the job done. Now there will be some exposed plywood edges on this build, but for the tabletop, I thought it would look really nice to use some hardwood edge banding, which is why I cut down some ash for this very job. For the tabletop, I just glued together 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, and you saw earlier in this video me using some screws on the underside of the tabletop as clamps. But don't worry, I took those screws out once the glue dried, so I can use those for a future project. This entire cabinet only required 2 sheets of plywood, 2 sets of door hinges, and 1 set of drawer slides. So all in all, this cabinet is fairly affordable compared to a lot of cabinets that I've seen. Sometimes even when using referential measurements, your pieces can fit a little too snug and you have to use a very advanced technique to fit them in. I'm a big believer that you don't have to have a ton of expensive tools or use a lot of advanced joinery techniques to make awesome stuff. Case in point, this whole cabinet's put together with pocket holes, dados, and rabbets. This project is actually going together really nicely. Hopefully I don't make any unnecessary holes in the near future. You know when you're installing door hinges and the package of the hinge says don't over tighten and you're like, no one tells me how hard to screw. So you tighten and you tighten until they're really, really secure, and then you look on the other side of the cabinet door and there's two little holes where the screws have poked through the other side. That may have happened to me. So don't over tighten your hinges. Well, those are definitely going to be the only extra holes in this project. Definitely. I like to use playing cards to make sure the reveal is the same all the way around my doors, and then it's just a matter of measuring, marking, and securing the door hardware to the cabinet sides. All right, that looks pretty good. Nice, actually looks nice. Okay, let's try the other one. Nice. I'll adjust it a tiny bit, but that looks nice. Now let's see if they both close. Nice. Hey, that looks pretty good. Nice. Now I just gotta figure out how to get them open. There we go. Okay, this method has never failed me when making drawers. You put the stuff that's going to be to the side of your drawer fronts, and then you measure that open space. And that open space is how wide your drawer fronts and backs need to be. This cabinet's going to have a hidden drawer behind the doors, so I needed to put in some drawer supports. This will give the drawer room to slide out. Because these drawer slide supports are extra thick with 3Cs, I want to make sure they're really secure, so I'm adding one of these support pieces underneath each one. These extra supports are about 1.5 inches wide and 18.5 inches long, and I'm securing them using wood glue and 3 screws. Yes, I realize I'm adding extra supports to support the supports. After I cut all these drawer pieces to size, I'm going to do something to the drawer front that's going to make this cabinet even more affordable, and it's going to allow me not to have to buy a drawer handle. I'm going to cut out the drawer handle with my router, and this is actually a look that I think looks really nice. This drawer is just getting put together with rabbets, glue, and lots of clamps. So I mentioned earlier how there will be no more extra holes in this project, and I lied. There will be some extra holes, and you will see why in just a second. I was supposed to install the drawer slides 1.75 inches from the top of the drawer, not 1.75 inches from the bottom as you see here. All right, let's see if the drawer fits. Oh, are you kidding me? I put the drawer slides in the wrong spot. Now, the reason I was so frustrated at this minor inconvenience was this was one of the last things I had to do to finish this project, and it was at the end of a long day of building, so I was a little tired, but it was a simple fix. Pretty nice. I like it. I like to put finish on my shop projects, yes, because it adds a little bit of protection, but mostly because it makes it look a lot nicer and really makes that grain pop. Now, I'd never really seen this 2-door, 1 hidden drawer look in a cabinet like this before, and I think it looks pretty nice, but let me know what you think in the comments. You can probably tell that I like to use spacers to get my measurements just right. And for the magnetic door stop, I'm using a 3/4 inch plywood spacer and cutting it to the exact size it needs to be. I'm making my doors recessed a 1/16 of an inch and not flush with the front for a very specific and technical reason. I feel like it. And I think it adds some depth to the cabinet. Finally, I get to make this area of my shop look a lot nicer, and I get some help from a very special guest, my beautiful wife.
Thank you. I love you.
I present to you the fun-sized base cabinet, and remember, be kind, be awesome. Yep, that's not going anywhere.